He found out his ex was pregnant, but is the child really his? And if it is, should he trust the woman who destroyed his marriage? Jake was torn between the present and the past. His love for Susan and the undeniable connection to Lori through the unborn child. Susan warned she wouldn't wait forever, while Lori was determined to make things right. Will he find the right path in this love-filled chaos, or lose everything? The answer left him stunned. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of Lori's, my wife's, phone vibrating on her nightstand. It was a familiar sound that had never aroused any suspicion before, but this time, something felt off. Lori wasn't in bed. Her side of the blanket was cold, and the house was completely silent. I got up, stepping carefully with my bare feet on the floor. A faint flicker of light was coming from downstairs, the TV, but when I went down, its screen was black. The light was coming from the kitchen. As I approached the door, I heard voices. She was talking to someone on the phone, but her words were muffled, as if she was trying to be discreet. "I know, but it was risky," Lori whispered. I stood there, trying to piece together what she was saying. She paused for a moment, listening, then added, "Yes, I miss you too. But we have to be careful." My heart started pounding. I could have walked in and asked her who she was talking to, but something held me back. I stepped away and went back upstairs, carefully ensuring she wouldn't notice my presence. Lying in the dark, I tried to come up with an explanation for her behavior. Lori had been working long hours lately. She said it was a project that demanded a lot of attention. But now, I had my doubts. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. Her smile was warm, and she even made my favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs and bacon. "How did you sleep, Jake?" she asked, placing the plate in front of me. Her voice was so genuine that I almost convinced myself it was all in my head. "Good," I replied, trying to maintain a normal tone. I didn't want her to suspect that something was bothering me. But now, I had a goal, to find out what was going on. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. Lori was spending more time on her phone but did so carefully, often stepping into another room or going out onto the terrace. She always left her phone face down, even when we were at the table or watching TV. We usually shared our devices easily, but now things were different. One evening, she said she had to work late again. I offered to drive her to the office, but she declined. "You don't need to, Jake. I'll probably be there until midnight anyway. It's a long day, and I don't want you waiting for me," she said, fastening her coat. Her words sounded reasonable, but now I doubted every detail. As soon as the door closed behind her, I grabbed my phone and started looking for answers. I checked her calendar in our family app. No entries about evening meetings. That wasn't like her. She always organized her schedule and kept everything noted. I tried looking at her messages through our shared account, but all the conversations were empty. She had deleted the history. Something pushed me to follow her. I grabbed my jacket, got into my car, and drove in the direction of her office, keeping a distance so she wouldn't notice. She didn't go toward the office but to another part of the city, to a small restaurant that was almost empty at this hour. I parked a bit further away, turned off my lights, and watched as Lori got out of the car. She looked different. Her hair was neatly done, and she was wearing a dress she rarely wore. It wasn't the look of someone heading to work late. I watched as she went inside. A few minutes later, I saw a man join her at a table by the window. They were talking, smiling, her eyes sparkling. My heart sank. When she came home, I was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. She quietly entered the room, took off her coat, and lay down next to me. Her perfume was different, something sweeter than usual. I felt her try to touch me, but I turned away. My thoughts were spinning, but I held back. I wasn't ready for a confrontation yet. The next morning, I acted as though nothing had happened. Lori was cheerful again, making breakfast, talking about our weekend plans. But now, I noticed the little things I had missed before. She avoided direct eye contact, spoke faster than usual, as if afraid I might ask the wrong question. "Lori, you got home late last night. How was work?" I asked casually. She froze for just a second, but it was enough for me to notice. "Oh, it was fine. We were just wrapping up an important project. I was barely standing by the end of it," she said, turning to the sink. Her back was tense, but I didn't press her. I knew I needed more evidence. That same day, I installed a tracking app on her phone that mirrored all her messages and calls to my device. It was a risky move, but I had to know the truth. A few hours later, I received the first notification, a message from the same man I had seen at the restaurant. "I can't wait to see you again," he wrote. Her response was brief, "Me too." That evening, she said she had to work late again. This time, I didn't follow her, but every message she sent appeared on my phone. They had arranged to meet again at the same restaurant. He called her sweetheart, and she responded with a smile in her words. It was more than I could bear, but I knew I couldn't act impulsively. A few days later, I decided to take the next step. I invited her to dinner at our favorite restaurant to talk. She looked surprised but agreed. As we sat at the table, I watched her, trying to find something genuine in her behavior. She was warm, even tried to joke, but I noticed her gaze occasionally dropping to her phone. "Lori, what's going on?" I asked suddenly, and she froze. "What do you mean?" Her voice was calm, but I could see the tension in her eyes. "I mean that you've been different lately. You're always busy, always on your phone, always rushing somewhere. I feel like you're hiding something," I said, looking her straight in the eyes. She looked away and tried to smile. "Jake, it's just work. You know I've been working a lot recently. You're worrying for nothing." "Then tell me who you were with at that restaurant 3 nights ago," I replied. Her face turned pale. She tried to say something, but the words got stuck in her throat. "Jake, it was just a colleague. We were discussing work matters," she began, but her voice was trembling. "Lori, I saw you." "It didn't look like a work meeting," I said, and her eyes filled with tears. She tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled away. "I want to know the truth. Now." She sat there in silence, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Jake, I got confused. It's not what you think. He's just a friend," she whispered, but I already knew it was a lie. Her face said more than her words ever could. Lori sat before me, her eyes lowered, and tears trickled down her face. A heavy silence hung in the air, and I couldn't take it anymore. "Lori, stop. Don't tell me he's just a friend. I saw the way you looked at him. It's more than friendship, and you know it," I said, holding back my urge to raise my voice. She sighed, as if unsure where to start. "Jake, it was a mistake. I don't know how it happened. We just started talking, and over time, it got complicated," she whispered. "Talking? Lori, you call that talking? I saw your messages, read what you wrote to him." "Don't pretend it meant nothing," I said, feeling my hands clench into fists. Her eyes filled with fear as she realized I knew more than she had assumed. "You read my messages?" Her voice was a mix of shame and indignation. "Yes, I did. I knew something was wrong, and I had to find out the truth. And now I know. You betrayed me, Lori. You betrayed our family," I replied coldly. She shook her head, as if wanting to deny it, but couldn't find the words. "Jake, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was lonely. You were always busy. We hardly talked. I just wanted someone to pay attention to me," she said, her voice breaking. "Lonely? Lori, you didn't even try to talk to me. If you felt lonely, you should have said something. Instead, you went to someone else," I said, feeling my anger rise. She fell silent, and the silence returned. I sat there, looking at her, trying to understand how we had come to this point. In her eyes, I saw remorse, but also fear. Fear of losing what she had destroyed herself. "Jake, I want to fix this. I know I made a terrible mistake, but I love you. I don't want to lose our family," she said, leaning toward me. I pulled away, feeling her words carried no weight. "Love me? Lori, love is actions, not words. And your actions say something entirely different," I replied firmly. "I can't live like this anymore. I can't trust you after everything that's happened." She covered her face with her hands, and I saw her shoulders shaking as she cried. But I no longer felt pity. All I felt was exhaustion and the desire to end this. When we returned home, Lori tried to talk to me again, but I stopped her. "I need to be alone. Just give me some space," I said, and she nodded without saying anything more. The next day, I decided to start the divorce process. I called a lawyer and explained the situation. He was understanding and professional, asking for details and giving advice. During our conversation, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was the beginning of the end, but also the beginning of a new chapter. That evening, when I got home, Lori was waiting for me in the kitchen. She looked tired, as if she hadn't slept all night. "Jake, we need to talk," she said as I walked in the door. "I've already said everything I wanted to say." "Lori, it's over," I replied, but she shook her head. "I know, but please, hear me out. I know I've lost your trust, but I want you to know this wasn't your fault. It was about me, about my weaknesses. You deserve better, and I'm sorry I couldn't give you that," she said, and her words sounded sincere. "You're right. I do deserve better. And it's not something you can give me," I replied. She nodded, her face sad, but she didn't argue. That was the last thing we said to each other that night. Over the next few weeks, we discussed the details of the divorce. Talking about splitting our assets was hard, but my biggest concern was how this would affect our daughter. Lori was worried too, and we both agreed to do everything we could to make sure Sophie didn't feel abandoned. One day, while I was playing with Sophie in the park, she suddenly asked, "Daddy, do you still love Mommy?" Her question caught me off guard. I paused for a moment before answering. "Sophie, love between adults can change, but I will always love you. And that will never change," I said, hugging her. She nodded, seeming to understand more than I had expected. Time passed, and I started building a new life. I found a new apartment, closer to work, and began dedicating more time to myself. Lori continued to see Sophie, and we kept our relationship as civil as possible. But I knew this was the end of one chapter, and I was ready for the next. Life after the divorce began to take shape. My new home was small but cozy. I liked that everything here was simple, without unnecessary reminders of the past. Sophie spent every other weekend with me, and during that time, I focused entirely on her. We walked in the park, cooked together, and I did everything to make her feel loved. But there were still moments when she would look at me with her big eyes and ask, "Dad, do you miss Mom?" It always caught me off guard. "Sophie, sometimes I think about the times when we were all together. But now things are different. Sometimes changes are necessary to make us stronger," I would reply, running my hand through her hair. She would nod, though I could tell her heart still longed for the life we had before. One evening, after I dropped Sophie off at Lori's, I decided to stop by a nearby bar. It was a small place where you could just sit, have a drink, and not think about anything. The bartender, a man named Michael, immediately noticed I wasn't a regular. "New in town, or just looking to forget something?" he asked, sliding me a beer. "Probably the latter," I replied with a smile. Michael nodded, and I felt like he understood more than he let on. "Looks like you've been through a rough patch." "Well, no one judges here," he added, and went to serve other customers. I felt an odd relief knowing no one was asking too many questions. A few minutes later, a woman walked into the bar. She was slightly younger than me, with chestnut hair and a simple smile. She sat at the counter a few seats away from me and ordered whiskey. Michael greeted her like she was a regular, which caught my attention. "Rough day?" I asked suddenly, surprising myself with my boldness. The woman looked at me, her eyebrows slightly raised. "Something like that," she replied, taking a sip from her glass. "And you?" "You could say it's been a rough year," I said with a slight smile. She smiled back. "Then we're definitely in the same boat." "I'm Susan," she said, extending her hand. "Jake," I replied, shaking her hand. Her warmth was unexpected and even a bit unsettling, but I suddenly realized I hadn't felt such ease in a conversation for a long time. We started talking, and I learned that Susan had also recently gone through a divorce. She shared how difficult it was to make that decision, but how she was now more focused on herself and her work. "That's strange," she said after we had a few drinks. "When you think your life is stable, it suddenly turns upside down." "Yeah, and you're forced to start over, even if you weren't ready," I replied. Our conversations were simple, but for the first time in a long while, they made me feel normal. We exchanged numbers, and I went home with a feeling that something had changed. Over the next few weeks, Susan and I started seeing each other more often. At first, it was casual meetups, coffee after work, walks in the park. She was easy to talk to, and it was exactly what I needed. One day, she suggested meeting Sophie, and I hesitated for a while but eventually agreed. "Dad, who's that?" Sophie asked as we approached the bench where Susan was waiting. "That's my friend Susan. She wanted to meet you," I said, trying to gauge how my daughter would react. Susan leaned down to Sophie with a smile. "Hi, Sophie. Your dad has told me a lot about you. He says you're the best artist," she said. Sophie glanced sideways at me and then laughed. "He says that to everyone," she replied, and I realized they were already forming a connection. That evening, when we got home, Sophie suddenly asked, "Dad, do you like Susan?" Her voice was calm, but I could feel her carefully waiting for my answer. "Yeah, she's a good person," I replied, trying to be honest. "Has she been through hard times too, like you?" Sophie asked. Her question caught me off guard, but I nodded. "Yes, she's trying to start over too. Just like us," I said, and Sophie simply nodded as if that answer satisfied her. My life was gradually getting back on track. Lori tried to talk to me a few more times, but those conversations were brief and no longer stirred any emotions in me. I realized I had let go of everything that had tied me to the past. One evening, as Susan and I sat on the terrace of my new house, she looked at me and said, "You know, Jake, I think you're finally happy. It shows." I thought for a moment, looking into her eyes. "Maybe for the first time in a long while, I feel like I can breathe again. And a lot of that is because of you," I said, and she smiled, taking my hand. That moment was simple yet significant. It showed me that life can give you a second chance if you're willing to take it. Life finally felt stable. Days passed calmly, without the drama and tension that once seemed normal. Susan and Sophie got along wonderfully, and it brought me immense relief. I loved watching them laugh together, playing board games, or chatting about small things. But, as often happens when you feel in control, life throws unexpected surprises your way. One day, while working in my office, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was low and slightly hesitant. "Jake, this is Tom. You don't know me, but we need to talk." "It's important," the man said. "Tom? I'm not sure I understand. What's this about?" I replied, feeling a bit on edge. "It's about Lori. I think you deserve to know what's been going on. Can we meet?" His words sounded strange, and I couldn't figure out what he wanted. But his mention of Lori set me on alert. "Okay, tell me where," I replied, and we agreed to meet at a cafe downtown. When I arrived at the cafe, Tom was already waiting for me. He looked about my age, a bit tired but confident. We shook hands, and he gestured for me to sit. "Jake, I didn't want to interfere in your life, but I think you need to know the truth," he began. "The truth about what?" I asked, staring at him tensely. "I was the man Lori was seeing behind your back," he said, and my heart skipped a beat. "What?" I said, feeling the blood rush to my face. "Let me explain. I didn't know she was married when we met. She told me you were divorced, that there hadn't been anything between you for a long time. I believed her, Jake. But when I found out the truth, I ended it," he said, looking me straight in the eye. I sat in silence, trying to process his words. They confirmed what I already knew, but added a new layer of betrayal. Lori hadn't just cheated on me. She had created an entire parallel world where I didn't even exist. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Because I only recently found out you were her ex-husband. Lori never mentioned your name, but I saw a picture of your daughter when she left her phone unlocked. That's when everything became clear. I felt I had to tell you." "You deserve to know," he replied. I took a deep breath and lowered my gaze. "That's in the past. It's all over between us. But thank you for telling me," I said, though my mind was racing with thoughts. "One more thing," Tom added. "Lori reached out to me recently. She wanted to rekindle things, but I told her it wasn't possible. I thought you should know." After our conversation, I left the cafe with a heavy heart. It felt as though the past was trying to creep back into my life just when I had begun to move forward. When I got home, I saw Susan sitting with Sophie, reading her a book. They were laughing, and that sound brought me back to reality. Later that evening, I told Susan about my meeting with Tom. She listened carefully, without interrupting. "Do you still feel anything for Lori?" she asked, looking at me. "No," I replied firmly, "but I'm angry at how she keeps trying to interfere in my life, even though we're no longer together." "Jake, you can't control her actions, but you can control your response. You've already made your decision, and now you need to let it go," Susan said, placing her hand on mine. Her words were simple but true. The next day, I decided to meet with Lori to put everything to rest. We agreed to meet at the park where we used to walk with Sophie. She arrived looking a bit unsettled. "Jake, why did you want to talk?" she asked as we sat on a bench. "I met with Tom," I said, watching her reaction. Her face fell. I don't know what he told you, but it doesn't matter," she began, but I cut her off. "It does matter. Lori, I want you to know that I'm no longer going to let you interfere in my life. I don't hold a grudge against you, but what we had is over. I'm happy now, and I need you to understand that our paths have diverged," I said firmly. She sat silently, looking at her hands. "I know, Jake. I lost everything, and it's my fault. I didn't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted to try to make things right," she said. "The only thing you can do is be a good mother to Sophie." "That's all," I replied. She nodded, and we parted ways without another word. That evening, when I returned home, I felt that something had changed for the first time in a long while. The past no longer had a hold on me, and I was ready to move on. Susan was waiting for me with a cup of coffee, and I realized that the future looked much brighter than I had ever imagined. Life went on, but Lori didn't seem ready to let go of the situation so easily. She began coming up with excuses to stay involved in my life, needing to discuss something important about Sophie or suggesting we meet to stay friends for the sake of the child. I tried to maintain distance, but it wasn't always easy to avoid her presence. One evening, when Sophie was at her grandmother's, Lori called me. Her voice sounded unusual, slightly tense, slightly unsure. "Jake, I had a bad day. I don't know who else to talk to. Could we meet?" "I promise it won't take long," she said. "Lori, I don't think that's a good idea," I replied, but she insisted. "Jake, it's just a conversation. We're adults. Please." Her voice sounded genuinely in need of support. After a pause, I gave in. "Fine, but not for long," I said. We agreed to meet at my house. When Lori arrived, she brought a bottle of wine. I thought a little wine wouldn't hurt. "You don't mind, do you?" she asked, and I just shrugged. She looked tired, but at the same time, there was a glint in her eyes that I couldn't quite place. We sat at the table, and the conversation started off casual. She talked about work, about Sophie, even mentioned how they laughed together at some cartoon. The wine quickly emptied, and before I knew it, I was feeling more relaxed. "You know, Jake, I really regret how we ended up here. You were the best thing in my life, and I ruined it all," she said suddenly, looking at me over her glass. "Lori, we've already talked about this. We're both moving on," I replied, trying to keep my distance. But her gaze felt like it was trying to pierce through my thoughts. "Have you really moved on? Are you truly happy without me?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but I sensed a challenge in it. "Yes, Lori. I've started a new life," I said. "And yet, here we are. Together. Just you and me," she said, leaning closer. Her hand touched mine, and I felt my heart start to race. The wine had made me more relaxed, and I didn't immediately realize what was happening. Suddenly, she leaned in and kissed me. It caught me off guard, but instead of pushing her away, I responded. In that moment, my mind went blank. Every thought I had vanished, and I just went with the flow. We moved to the living room, and everything happened so quickly that I didn't even have time to process what I was doing. When I woke up the next morning, Lori was already gone. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together what had happened. What had I done? I was so sure that it was all in the past, that I was moving on. But now everything felt confusing again. I gathered my thoughts and went to the kitchen. On the table was a note. "Thank you for last night. It felt like old times. I hope you feel the same. Lori." Her words hit me like a hammer. She had used that moment. She knew exactly what she was doing, and now I felt trapped. Throughout the day, I tried to focus on work, but thoughts of Lori wouldn't leave me alone. I felt as though I had betrayed myself and Susan. What would I tell her? Should I even say anything at all? That evening, Susan called me. Her voice was as warm as always. "Hi, Jake. How was your day?" she asked. "Fine," I replied, though I knew I sounded insincere. "You sound tense. Is everything okay?" she asked, sensing my mood. "Yeah, just a lot on my plate," I said, trying to avoid the conversation. But she could tell something was wrong. "Jake, I know you. If something's bothering you, you can tell me," she said. I stayed silent, unsure of how to respond. In the end, I decided not to tell her just yet. I was too scared of what it could destroy. The next day, Lori called again. Her voice was confident, even a bit bold. "Jake, I've been thinking about last night. I'm sure you have too. Isn't it proof that there's still something between us?" she asked. "Lori, it was a mistake. We shouldn't have done it," I replied firmly. "But you did, and that means something. You can't just ignore it," she insisted. "I can, and I will." "Lori, it doesn't change anything. There's nothing between us," I said, and for the first time, she fell silent. I hung up the phone and realized I had to figure out how to move forward. I needed to focus on what mattered, Sophie and Susan. But I also understood that the past wasn't done playing its games. The days after that night dragged on, as if time had decided to slow down. I tried not to think about what had happened with Lori, but it was useless. Every time I saw her name on my phone or heard her voice, it turned my world upside down. I kept telling myself it was just a mistake, but the truth was more complicated. Part of me began to doubt whether I had made the right choice in letting her go. Susan noticed that I had become more distant, but she didn't push. She was patient, and that only added to my guilt. I knew she deserved better than what I could give her at that moment. One day, Lori called me and asked to meet. Her voice was serious, and she sounded like she wanted to talk about something important. I hesitated, but eventually agreed. We met at a cafe where we used to spend time together. She sat at a table, holding a cup of coffee, and looked tense. "Jake, I need to tell you something," she began when I sat across from her. "What now, Lori? What are you trying to do this time?" I asked, feeling my anger rise again. "This isn't about trying to get anything back. It's about the truth. I've lied to you a lot, and I know you deserve to know everything," she said, lowering her gaze. I frowned, not understanding where she was going. "What truth, Lori? What else have you been hiding from me?" She took a deep breath. "I cheated on you before, long before our problems started. It happened more than once. But it wasn't because I didn't love you. Jake, you were the only person I truly loved," she said, her voice breaking. My heart sank. I felt each of her words hit me like a blow. "You're joking, right? You're telling me that our entire life was a lie?" I asked, unable to believe what I was hearing. "No, it wasn't. Jake, I need to explain. I tried to fight it. I went to doctors, to therapy, but it's like something stronger than me," she said. "Stronger than you? Lori, what are you even talking about?" I asked, trying to make sense of her logic. I have nymphomania, Jake. It's like an addiction. I constantly needed attention, constantly craved that adrenaline that new relationships bring. But I hated myself for it. I tried to fight it, but I always lost," she said, tears streaming down her face. I sat there, paralyzed. Her explanation was so unexpected that I didn't know how to react. She continued, "This isn't an excuse, I know, but I want you to know that I didn't do it because you weren't enough. You were more than enough. I was the one who was broken. Lori, if you knew something was wrong, why didn't you tell me earlier? Why did you let me live a lie?" I asked, feeling both anger and despair. "I was afraid you'd leave me. I thought I could hide it, that I could control myself. But I couldn't," she replied. That night, I came home feeling completely drained. Susan was there, her smile as warm as ever. "Hi, Jake. How was your day?" she asked, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. "Hi. It was fine," I replied, avoiding her gaze. I couldn't tell her what I had just heard. It was too complicated, too painful. For the next few days, I couldn't get Lori's words out of my head. Part of me began justifying her actions, thinking that it wasn't her fault, that she was truly battling something beyond her control. But another part of me reminded me of all the betrayals, the lies, and the pain she caused me. Susan could tell something was wrong. One evening, she sat down next to me and placed her hand on my knee. "Jake, I know you're hiding something. You can trust me. Whatever it is, we can handle it together," she said, looking into my eyes. I sighed, realizing I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. "Susan, it's about Lori. She told me something, and I just don't know how to deal with it," I said. "What exactly?" she asked cautiously. I told her everything. About Lori's infidelity, her justification using her condition, and my mixed feelings. When I finished, Susan looked shocked, but her voice remained calm. "Jake, you can't let her pull you back into this chaos. This is her battle, not yours. You did everything you could, but now you need to focus on yourself and Sophie. And on us, if that's what you want," she said. Her words were direct but honest. I knew she was right, but it didn't make my internal conflict any easier. I felt torn between the past and the present, between what I felt and what was right. In the following days, I decided to distance myself from Lori. She tried to reach out to me several times, but I kept my responses short and emotionless. I realized I couldn't help her if she wasn't willing to help herself. Susan stayed by my side, and I was grateful for her patience. She made it clear that she was willing to fight for our relationship, but only if I was ready to move forward. It wasn't an easy journey, but I started to see a light at the end of the tunnel. Life slowly began to return to normal, but I knew I hadn't fully let go of what had happened. Susan was patient and understanding, but I could see how my detachment worried her. Lori had stopped calling, and that gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in a long time. But deep down, I knew, if she reappeared, everything could turn upside down again. One day, while working in my office, there was a knock at the door. It was Sophie. Her small face looked concerned. "Dad, Mom was acting really weird today," she said, sitting in the chair across from me. "What do you mean, Sophie?" I asked, setting my laptop aside. She was crying. I asked her what was wrong, but she just said she misses you, my daughter replied. Her eyes filled with sadness. My heart sank. I knew Lori was emotionally unstable, but I didn't want it to affect Sophie. "Listen, sweetheart, Mom is just going through a hard time. It's not your job to solve her problems. You can always come to me if something's bothering you, okay?" She nodded and hugged me. Her embrace reminded me of what I needed to stay strong for. That evening, I decided to call Lori. She answered almost immediately, her voice sounding like she had been waiting for this call. "Jake, I'm glad you called," she said, and I could hear a hint of hope in her voice. "Lori, this is about Sophie. She told me you were crying today, and that you mentioned me. You can't drag her into your emotions," I said, sharper than I intended. "I didn't mean for her to see that." "It wasn't intentional," Lori replied. "Then keep your emotions in check." "I don't want Sophie caught up in our issues," I replied. "Jake, do you think I don't know that? I'm doing everything I can to pull myself together, but it's not easy," she said, and I could hear the anger and despair in her voice. "Lori, this is your battle. I can't be part of it anymore. I said it before, and I'm saying it now. We're done," I replied, trying to remain firm. "Then why are you still thinking about me?" she asked, catching me off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying not to fall into her trap. "You can say it's over, but I see it in your eyes every time we meet. You still feel something for me, Jake. And it scares you," she said. Her words stung, but a part of me knew she was right. I felt something, but it was more of a struggle with myself than true feelings. "Lori, you don't understand. I'm not the person I used to be, and I can't go back to that," I said, trying to convince not just her, but myself. That evening, I sat in silence for a long time after the call. I knew I had allowed Lori to get into my head, and that was a mistake. I decided to talk to Susan and tell her how I was feeling. She deserved to know what was going on. That night, I invited Susan to dinner. We were sitting at her favorite restaurant, and I finally worked up the courage. "Susan, I need to talk to you about something important," I began. She looked at me, her eyes full of warmth and concern. "What's wrong, Jake?" "You're scaring me," she replied. "It's about Lori. Lately, I feel like I can't fully let her go. She keeps reappearing in my life, and it's making everything more complicated. I know it's unfair to you, But I don't want you to think I'm hiding anything, I said honestly. Susan was silent for a few seconds before she responded. Jake, I appreciate your honesty. I know divorce is hard, and you have every right to have mixed feelings. But I also know that I can't come second to someone else. If you're not sure about us, please tell me now, she said. I'm sure I want to be with you. But I understand that I need to deal with these feelings about Lori and find a way to put an end to it once and for all, I replied. Susan nodded. Then do it, Jake. And do it quickly. I want to be with you, but I won't wait forever, she said, her words direct but fair. The next day, I decided to meet with Lori one last time. We arranged to meet at the park where we used to spend time with Sophie. She arrived on time, looking calm, but I knew it was just a facade. Why did you want to meet? She asked as we sat on a bench. Lori, this has to end. We can't keep going through this cycle. I won't be your solution, and you won't be mine. This is the end, I said, looking her straight in the eyes. She was silent, but I could see her lips trembling slightly. I thought we could start over. But if that's how you feel, I won't chase you anymore, she said quietly. Those words brought relief. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could move on. I said goodbye to Lori and went home to Susan, knowing I had made the right decision. The day started like any other, but I had no idea it would turn into one of the worst of my life. Lori texted me, saying she had found one of Sophie's old toys and asked if I could come pick it up. I didn't want to go, but the thought of Sophie made me agree. Fine, I'll stop by after work, I replied shortly. When I arrived at her house, the door was slightly ajar. Come in, Jake. I heard her voice from inside. Taking a deep breath, I stepped in. Lori stood near the stairs, wearing a stunning set of black lingerie that accentuated her figure. My heart started racing, and I couldn't look away. Lori, what is this? I came to pick up a toy for Sophie, I said, trying to stay focused. Jake, I know there's still something between us. Why deny it? Her voice was seductive as she took a step closer. Lori, stop. This isn't what I want, I said, but my words lacked the conviction I had hoped for. Then why aren't you leaving? She asked, staring directly into my eyes. I opened my mouth to respond, but instead, the tension between us escalated into something it shouldn't have. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. We spent the night together, and I found myself back in the trap I had been trying to escape for months. When I woke up the next morning, Lori was beside me. She looked content, but all I felt was shame and guilt. Jake, you know what this means. We still need each other, she said, stroking my arm. This was a mistake. I can't. I shouldn't have stayed, I replied, quickly getting up. Why do you keep fighting what's obvious? We're meant for each other, she said, smiling at me. I got dressed as quickly as I could, determined to leave, but as soon as I opened the door, I saw Susan standing there. Her face was a mix of anger and heartbreak. What are you doing here, Jake? She asked, her voice trembling. Susan, I can explain, I began, but she raised her hand to stop me. Don't. I've already seen enough, she said, looking me directly in the eyes. Susan, this doesn't mean anything. It was a mistake. I tried to justify myself, but her expression didn't change. A mistake? You went back to her after everything that's happened. How could you? Her voice grew louder, and I noticed Lori standing behind me, watching the scene with a satisfied smirk. Susan, it's not what you think, I repeated, but she shook her head. Jake, I gave you a chance. I trusted you, but you've destroyed it again. Now, I don't know if I can be with you, she said, turning away and quickly walking to her car. I stood there, unsure of what to do. Lori placed a hand on my shoulder. Jake, now we have a chance to start over. You just need to accept it, she said. Lori, you just ruined my life. You don't even realize it, I replied, pulling away from her. For the next few days, I tried to reach out to Susan, but she didn't answer my calls or messages. I knew she was hurt, and I couldn't blame her. At the same time, Lori kept calling me, but I ignored her. I felt trapped, as if every decision I made only made things worse. A week later, Lori called again. I almost didn't answer, but something compelled me to pick up. Her voice sounded serious. Jake, we need to talk, she said. About what? Lori? What else could you possibly have to say? I asked wearily. I'm pregnant, she replied, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. What? Was all I could manage to say. I found out a few days ago. It's your baby, Jake. Her voice was quiet but confident. I sat down, trying to gather my thoughts. How can you be sure? I asked. Because I haven't been with anyone else. Only you, she replied. Lori's words scrambled all my thoughts. I didn't know what to do. My life was already chaotic, and now this. How could I be the father of Lori's child when I was just beginning to build a new life with Susan? And was there even a way to fix this? Jake sat in his apartment, holding his phone in his hands. His head was spinning with thoughts. Lori's pregnancy felt like a new trap, but part of him doubted if it was true. Could she have made it up just to pull him back in? He decided he needed to find out the truth. He called Lori. Are you sure this is my child? He asked, trying to hide the anxiety in his voice. Jake, I wouldn't lie about something like this. I'm willing to do any test necessary if it will ease your mind, she said, sounding sincere. He agreed. A test was the only way to know the truth and find some stability in the chaos. At the same time, Jake didn't know how Susan would take this. Should he tell her right away? Or should he try to handle it on his own? The next day, he met Lori at the clinic. The procedure was quick, but the tension between them hung in the air. Lori sat across from him, clutching her purse. Her gaze was soft, and she tried to touch his hand. I know you doubt me, but I really want us to have a chance to start over, Jake, she whispered. I'm not here for a second chance. I'm here for the truth, he replied, pulling his hand away. He couldn't stop thinking about Susan. Her support had been like a light in a dark tunnel, but now that light seemed distant. When he returned home, hoping to find some peace, he found her waiting at his door. We need to talk, she began without greeting him. Her face was tense, and she was holding his favorite mug, as though she had brought it along to make the conversation less formal. Susan, I know I should have told you sooner, but, he began, but she interrupted him. I know about Lori's pregnancy. She texted me. She said you're going to be a father, and that it means you two should be together. Why does she think she has the right to tell me that? Jake felt the ground shift beneath him. He had no idea Lori had interfered this much. I was going to explain everything. We did a test to find out the truth, he said, trying to calm her. And if it's your child, Jake, what will you do then? Susan asked. He was silent. He didn't know the answer. A few days passed. The test results were due to arrive that day, and Jake couldn't sit still. When the phone finally rang, he answered immediately. The doctor's voice was calm, but his words turned Jake's world upside down. The results confirmed that you are the father, Mr. Jake. Jake felt a mix of emotions, joy, fear, despair. He didn't know what to do now. Lori insisted on meeting, and this time, he couldn't avoid it. Now you see, Jake, this is a sign. We can be a family, a real family, she said, beaming. And what about the past, Lori? What about everything that happened between us? How do you imagine we can just forget it and start over? He asked, his voice heavy with frustration. I know there's been a lot of pain, but this is our chance. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work, Lori said, her voice filled with determination. Susan, after learning the results, began to distance herself. Her words still echoed in his mind. I can't be with you if you keep the door to the past open, Jake, but I also don't want to lose you. It's up to you to decide who you want to be with. Jake found himself in a desperate conflict. He couldn't imagine his life without Susan, but he also couldn't ignore the fact that he was going to be a father. Lori was now part of his life, whether he wanted it or not. One evening, as he sat at home, his phone rang. It was Susan. I want you to meet me. There's still a chance for us, Jake, but you have to be honest, with yourself and with me, she said. He agreed. They met in the park where they used to spend a lot of time together. Her gaze was firm, but her voice was full of sadness. Jake, I love you, but I won't wait while you decide who matters more. You have to figure this out now, she said. Susan, you're everything I want. But how can I ignore the fact that I'm going to be a father? He replied, feeling torn apart. Their conversation went on for a long time, and by the end, Susan simply nodded. I'm giving you time. But don't forget, I won't wait forever. The next morning, Jake met with Lori to discuss the future. She again started talking about their second chance. But this time, he was more reserved. Lori, I can't just come back to you. That's not how this works. I will be the father of our child, but I can't promise that we'll be together, he said. She looked disappointed but agreed. I understand, but I'll still fight for us, she replied. Time passed, but the decision didn't get any clearer. Lori did everything she could to show she had changed, while Susan remained distant, waiting for Jake to decide whether he was ready to leave the past behind. One day, while Jake was in the park with Sophie, she suddenly asked, Dad, will I have a new mom? The question caught him off guard. He didn't know what to say. Sophie, I don't know yet, but you'll always be my top priority, he said, trying to be honest. Life went on, but the answer Jake had been searching for still seemed elusive. He was stuck between two women, each representing a different part of his life, the past and the future. When he looked at their pictures, he knew no choice would be perfect. But sooner or later, he would have to make a decision. And yet, for now, Jake remained in limbo, knowing that the answer lay not only in his heart, but also in whether he could reconcile all the broken pieces of his life. What do you think? Should Jake trust Lori again because of the upcoming child, or should he leave the past behind and risk losing Susan?